Hi, everybody. I wasn't planning to say anything, so Jesse, you can just get it started. If you have some discussion questions or anything that you can throw out there, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. So I think the idea here was, and I like this group. This particular discussion is going to be interesting because we've been talking for a while about expanding Sinopia cataloging. And so therefore that implies that there are already a number of people who are already involved. Of course, many of us are, but not all of us are. And the way that it's being developed in the cohort and people who are doing most of the testing is sort of in a certain situation, certain environment, certain types of institutions. And then there are a lot of behind the scenes players which are doing some technical things and some other connections and sort of side projects, like with maybe integrating Sinopia with Folio, or trying to figure out the conversations that involve Sinopia with share BDE data, etc. So there's a ton of things happening which may not be like completely represented by metadata production in Sinopia. These are ongoing developments, challenges are being worked on over time as the various stakeholders are throwing themselves into the work. And let me just introduce myself real quickly before we go into the topic. I'm Jesse Lambertson. I'm the Metadata Digital Resources Librarian at University of Chicago's Law School, Law Library. So just want to say hello to everybody, and I'm glad that you're joining from all the places that you're joining. I'm in some kind of hyperspace place now, virtual reality or whatever. So my question has to do with, or in start rather, do people remember? There's some context here that will need to change as we go through the hour. So I just want to sort of get a sense of where people are, and they can answer this question verbally or in the chat, however it is they feel. The question has to do people remember sort of how they first learned about Sinopia? Sort of like what it was as a thing. Just curious, and if you could maybe describe that, I'd be happy to hear how people first learned about Sinopia in the early days, maybe 2 years ago, or maybe 4 years ago. Just curious. Anybody want to talk about how they first learned about Sinopia and the effort therein? Oh, good. So somebody's saying they just learned about it in the last 3 or 4 months. That's the good stuff. That's what we want to hear. We do want to hear that there are people who are learning about it, and that they are clearly here at this linked data conference, learning about how it plays a role in the larger linked data, for production environments that we're trying to work in. 2 years ago, in the Boston conference, 2-ish years ago, whatever that was, question mark. So I'm not sure if the question mark related to 2 or to Boston, but we'll assume it's to the 2. Oh, and then last year's. Oh, good. That's great. So we're definitely looking at consistent conference themes and topics coming up. And we can go on about this, and I'm happy to have people add their comments. And I think when I first heard about it, I think it might have been at a PCC meeting some years ago in DC, in which I had heard about what it was, and I knew that we were looking at some kind of linked data editor, but I didn't quite understand what this implementation was. And I'd heard about it sort of in the word, and I was like, Sinopia, that sounds like a cool word, but like, what does it mean? Of course, what does the word have to do with, the work of, and then someone else saying at a conference 2 or 3 years ago, thank you, Misty, for that. What is the word? What does that word without context, tell us about what the work is being done? And so I think that was probably 4 years ago-ish, 4.5 years ago, when I first heard about Sinopia. So just curious about that. Obviously there is a grant cycle happening behind the scenes, which involves some monies coming in from the Mellon Foundation, if I'm not mistaken, that is funding some of the dev things. And thank you for that comment about it being maybe just for VivFrame. That's a very point we actually want to bring up, that distinction today. VivFrame will be one of the very important points that can be used in that we can apply to Sinopia, but it's not going to be the only one. So the question then has to do with these dev cycles that have been gradually bringing into play comments, technical bugs, just general things that happen with any large development project of sorts in which there's so many moving parts. We have a testing server, we have a production server, and there's a dev server, which is of course where a lot of the first technical server things take place. That's why they call it dev. The words have meaning. And so just sort of think about how these cycles have come into play. We have seen not just technical integrations, expansion, functionality, the embedding of the controlled vocabulary sources, either as caches or as direct queries, various situations which are happening in the background. And I'm just curious, do people remember this? It's not that long ago, actually. But do people remember when there was a lot more, as you were working on what we would formally call profiles? Do people remember when they were working on profiles and they were doing things like saving their profiles in like GitHub or in exporting them in a text edit to be used in a text editor? Do people remember this? And do you miss it, or do you think it's like just great to sort of move beyond the external export of profiles into a more sort of template-based thing? Any comments on this from people? And what do they think? What do you think about it? Say whatever. All thoughts are free here.
I can share my comments. I do not miss it. It was a complicated workflow. I did not miss it, and I miss it. I miss the opportunity of having to be able to open the profile on an editor, and I was using Atom to edit the JSON file, and I was able to do changes very quick. And now I have to like go through the template to do the changes. So in that sense, I missed that opportunity of doing the changes right on the code, which I'm assuming like if you could export the RDF, you could exactly do the same and then import it again. I just don't think that we can export the RDA. Can we? I don't know, for the profiles. Michelle?
I don't know, because when you're editing a profile template, sorry, I don't know if you can preview the RDF. I'm checking right now. But if not, we can certainly make a request for the developers to add that.
Because it's easy when you can just like do the updates directly on the code.
Yeah.
I know that that's not for everybody, and there's going to be people that are more interested in, or not more interested, but like feel more comfortable using the link data editor to do any sort of editing.
Yeah.
But
is it okay if I share my screen?
Of course.
Okay.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So here's where I was here. Resource templates, and I want to look at this demo one, click the pencil to edit it. So you could preview it, look at it in JSON or Turtle, or maybe triples. I think any of these formats could be copy, which, you know, even if you select all, that's not so easy. You have to like click and drag all this, then save it, and then copy it. Then you'd have to go to load RDF and load it back up. So I haven't tested that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I see what you're saying. I think we should put in a ticket, because there might be like, I'm sure there could be an easier way that the developers could create for people that want to edit it, edit the plain text of it. So
thank you.
Yeah, I could add that.
That's great.
Add that as a ticket.
The reason I ask about this question is because the profile, which was kind of a matrix of templates, in which we had a profile, sort of a meta profile in the sense we're a meta template, that included things where we're dealing with the sub pieces that we would associate with, the work, subjects, instance related data, item related data, all of which was actually kind of working together as one thing called a profile. And that was mostly dealt with, and it still is fundamentally dealt with, related to format. We had some format specificities we need to deal with. We had some monograph things, we need some serials things. There was another group that came about working with specifically, special materials, rare materials. There was definitely some side work happening on things that we wouldn't even assume would be like paper or bookish. They would be more like 3D objects, all kinds of things, sculpture objects, or any kind of thing that would be, collected by an institution of any sort working in this RDF editor. And so, and the reason I bring this up is because for a while, and this is really what I think the crux of the conversation is, that they start thinking about the future and expanding of Sinopia cataloging, because there have obviously been significant changes, and there's going to be a lot of more UX changes that will be coming forward just generally over time as we finesse it. That's this normal process for development and getting more and more eyes on it, more and more people who are trying to do production in it, which of course expands, the sort of little walls or bumps you hit throughout this normal work. But I think my question has to do with, or the comment rather, has to do with, well, let me just clarify the context real quick before I go on to that. And that would be that once the profile had been gotten rid of and everything was basically individual templates, which had to do with works and instances and items, administrative metadata, sub-templates that would have to do with identifiers, various things that you would then add as properties, and in templates. And then so your profile was not so much, a larger matrix. You would basically just sort of have a template that you would build sort of a closer one-to-one relationship between the metadata description set and the object being described. And so you need to attach certain things with that. Either you were querying for control vocabulary, you needed to add some administrative metadata, which is really a big deal. In fact, the administrative metadata seems to be, and in some ways, there's an ongoing thing, but it's in good shape, I think, generally for some kind of productive use, or at least, well, that's what we'll say right now. Just sort of let that go for the time being. And because we had this Profiles Affinity Group, which ran 3 years or 4 years, I don't know exactly how long it ran over the cycles of the thing. And then I moved into chair of that group. And then within a few months, we kind of started to discuss or realize what the discussions were happening. So what they were happening around, and also where we thought they might need to go. So we had some discussions on it. We had some votes on it. And then the decision was made to basically dissolve the Profiles Affinity Group, which now is currently dissolved. So now you're asking, well, why are we having a discussion about the Profiles Affinity Group here in LD4? Well, the question actually has to do with the future of Sinopia work. And this, what I mean is, in my thinking and in my justification for putting forth the case for dissolving the group, my thought had to do with trying to deal with the expansion of Sinopia cataloging and bringing on new people into that group, in which there would be more of a training for sort of a train the trainers in a sense, but training how folks would create their templates that they need. So we run into issues when it comes to how people want to use PCC only templates and not PCC only templates. And of course, that is really for PCC institutions, which may not apply to every organization here. So I just want to bring that up as sort of a caveat, sort of in the background. The other comment then has to do with what a future of a training group for Sinopia templates would be. So even though it was an affinity group before, in my mind, I saw it as being now for the future a series of some group of people who would commit to being there as a trainer to help new institutions create custom templates if needs be, as those numbers gradually increase in Sinopia cataloging. What do people think about that as an idea? Relative to sort of talking with just design things, or just sort of bugs we find, or sort of just talking about the abstractions of what it means to have, you know, or like, what does it work? What is an instance, right? These are philosophical conversations, which of course will never go away. They're still going to be with us in some form or fashion. But in terms of like more of a utilitarian or a pragmatic training group, I imagine this group could maybe become something like that. What do folks think about that? And I can see that Timothy Ryan Mendenhall shared the training around templates for PCC Sinopia cataloging affinity. So Timothy, would you like to say anything about that? Or is that something, go ahead, please say whatever you like.
Yeah, I can talk briefly about that. So the PCC Sinopia cataloging affinity group was just formed. I'm acting as facilitator and Greta de Groot is acting as a trainer. Our charge is basically is kind of aligns with what you're saying about just like training needs for like catalogers in Sinopia. And we had our first meeting on Monday during the conference. So we'd be interested in definitely like, you know, having a like meeting and having a discussion about you know, templates. We haven't like really looked into it, but we so the convening group, so there was a PCC task group on implementing the recommendations of, oh God, I can't remember the full thing, but basically the cataloging affinity group came out of this task group, and we had talked about template training as a possible need. So that would certainly be something we'd be interested in. I don't know, like if this group is dissolving or something, or morphing into something else, we'd be happy to like, you know, meet up and, you know, figure out like who does, you know, if the group continues in some fashion, like should we do template training, or should the profiles / templates group do training, or should we collaborate, or, you know, it's all kind of up in the air. But I just wanted to throw that out there that, you know, we're another PCC group, and we're considering or doing some training around that.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, and that's exactly, and so I think there's two questions that need to be looked at there. One of those is relative to Michelle's question about whether or not everyone knows what PCC is, which is the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. It's a cooperative, using the word cooperative to define the word cooperative is probably bad sentence, but I'm gonna say it. It's a collaboration, let's say the issues are a collaboration here of metadata productive institutions, and they are essentially agreeing to the standards of implementation of rules when it comes to things like RDA, authority work, etc. And a lot of these are academic institutions, though not all. And but that's sort of the context. You know, we're well aware that many people here at LD4 may not be PCC members. And so I want to make that clear. So thank you, Michelle, for bringing that out. And that clarified something that I was mentioning earlier. Relative to Timothy, do you prefer Timothy or Tim?
It doesn't matter. Most people actually call me Ryan. That's why I throw it in there. But
okay.
Timothy,
right,
Timothy is also fine.
I can call you Ryan. It's fine too. No worries.
Yeah, there's I'm not going to tell the family history about that, but
it's okay.
It's not interesting.
No. Yeah, this is not the Timothy Ryan Family History Conference. Anyway, no, it's good. It's funny. And so I just think about this idea of what PCC is versus what RDF-based cataloging may be, and where that falls. And so here, let me just be clear, Tim, or Ryan. I'll call you Ryan. Sorry. That the Profiles group is dissolved already. It is actually dissolved. So the question for us would be, well, let me just clarify a question for you. Would you think that the PCC training group would be only on PCC templates? My assumption would be yes.
Yeah. Yes, it would.
Okay.
Cool. We talked about that in the policy committee or the steering committee of PCC. I can't remember which one. Essentially, like sort of restricted the membership in the group to PCC members or PCC catalogers and to PCC templates. So,
okay.
So yes.
That's good. Thank you.
So it would not be the cataloging, the PCC cataloging affinity group for Sinopia would not be as potentially as broad ranging as a group could be.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the reason I bring that up is because there are definitely people who want to make use of, as there currently are, all kinds of people who make use of PCC standards without themselves being PCC members or PCC catalogers. And so that is, I think, always going to be the case. And I think we're going to assume that will probably carry on in Sinopia too. There'll be many people who will make use of those well-built templates, and they won't necessarily code them as PCC. Arden asked this question about how people are doing using Sinopia for visual resources artifacts. So this is definitely a big question, and this is something I think that the training group could come into play, working with, to accomplish. And the reason I ask this question generally is because we know that, or I believe, I could say I believe that Sinopia will be used for not only PCC production. Therefore, the question would be whether or not this group would need to do training on templates, and then would need to have a liaison or some kind of communication with the PCC training group. Does that seem like something that's appropriate for anybody out there? I mean, Brian, obviously, anybody else? And then the question would be whether or not the PCC training group obviously has a charge. They have a number of people who are on that group. I don't know how many people are on that group, but let's say it's 7 to 10. Let's just pick a number, 6 to 10, whatever it is. Number of people are on that group. And they are going to be producing some kind of documentation. I don't know if they're going to use like videos as training or sort of PowerPoints as training. I'm not sure. They'll work out those details. Is that the kind of thing that we would expect to see at, like, say, Catalogers Learning Workshop, and then it would be used by maybe lots of non-PCC people? Or do we need to have a separate group that would be working on training for non-PCC Sinopia users? That's sort of like, I think, a crux of this particular sub-question. I'll take any comments from anybody out there. Yeah, affinity group for arts and rare materials. I mean, for sure, that there might be a variation on that theme, but I don't know if that's also going to come under eventually like the PCC larger arm too, because they would probably also want to have an arts and rare materials group at some point doing it. But maybe, I don't know. Are you folks mostly focusing on monographs and serials, Ryan, or only monographs at this point? What are you mostly doing?
We're still sort of a little nebulous. So we're sending out a survey to PCC members to see like what they would want. Initially, we talked about just going through the PCC Sinopia training modules that were posted on the Catalogers Learning Workshop site. I'll try to drop the link into chat for folks. Yeah, we're not necessarily restricting ourselves to a specific formats. So if people would be interested in doing, other types of materials other than just standard print monographs, we would kind of go with the flow. We did, during the first session, Greta led a sort of like a demonstration of doing a print monograph, and then we provided 3 print monograph examples that people could catalog, although people tended to just kind of stay in the discussion rather than actually going and trying to use Sinopia. We were thinking of doing like kind of like the initial, I guess, impulse was maybe try to model ourselves a bit after the LD4 Wikidata Affinity Group and split between sort of presentation or discussion type of sessions with working sessions where people actually catalog in Sinopia. But we're gonna kind of like see what the people who come to the group want to do. But to answer the initial question, no, we're not looking to necessarily restrict ourselves to just one format, but we would probably want to like gradually step into more complex types of, entities for Sinopia. So we have started with basic monographs, but would be up for eventually getting into more complex things and aggregates and other formats.
Let me ask this question then. Thank you. That's important because that goes, because the expansion is happening in several fronts at the same time. It's not just generally getting more people into using Sinopia. It's also the expansion of standards building within Sinopia of people who are currently using it to some degree. So it's a series of, concentric circles going out. The question would be, and this would be maybe from the LD4 side. There was a question about asking if there are steps for using Sinopia, and there are definitely some tutorials already out there, and I think Michelle posted some good examples already of how to use Sinopia sort of in some sense. The questions come down to what kind of material you're cataloging, how you want to approach the granularity of the production, what standards you're using to enter the data. This is all kinds of factors there that you want to pull into consideration, which maybe we could call it, we could use the RDA language and pre-recording, thinking that has to be done in some sense to understand what you're actually doing in the editor. But my question then is from the LD4 side, do we need to have a communication of some type with the PCC training group? Or is the PCC training group going to become, or what they're doing in the PCC training group, would that become sort of like the de facto guidelines? Maybe it may not be always the standards for people who are going to be, non-PCC users, but would they just be using them as sort of the de facto guidelines? What are people's feelings on this in terms of having a two bubble approach, or do you need just one bubble? Any metaphor you like is fine. Thank you.
I think that the PCC training is very specific to a set of templates and a way of thinking and a certain audience. And because there's no other formal training, that's what I point people to, as it can apply, to using Sinopia in any way, but I don't think that will become the de facto training for Sinopia, because there are so many ways to use Sinopia. And if there's a need for additional documentation or training about Sinopia, then we could work on that from the Sinopia side, make it like a generic how to enter data, sort of like I've got some documentation up there now generically on how to create templates.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Paloma?
Yeah, I was just thinking as you guys are talking about that like we are talking about two different things. One thing is like, how do you create a template? And another thing is like, what should be on the template? So I don't know if the PCC cataloging group it's planning to do that first part, like how do you create a template regardless, because if you're adding a property, it doesn't matter what property it is. And then my other thought is that with that other question, what should go on the template, I think that there should be also some thought put towards like, how do we make templates that are being created in Sinopia interoperable? And that and I don't know again if like that should be something that it's based on like PCC requirements, but even if like we have like a PCC group that are creating resources, and I guess that I'm just thinking about B-Frame, and I know that you can use Sinopia for many other things, but if we have like institutions creating different resources and they don't necessarily want to use the PCC templates, there should be some sort of like common understanding of like how to make it interoperable anyway, because we are finding like issues with other like B-frame implementations outside of Sinopia. So I think that it makes sense also for a profiles group to be like overarching, not necessarily just PCC, to have, I remember we started some best practices, and Sinopia has evolved so much since those best practices were created that it would make sense to have a group that actually works on best practices for the new, or like the current iteration of Sinopia. And I'm not sure how much it's going to evolve after this. And maybe Michelle can talk a little bit about that. But like, I will say that like, there's still some sort of ground for like a profiles interest group that is not just training, but also best practices.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And it reminds me of another conversation recently I was having about with a FAST committee I'm in. We were talking recently about not the general abstracted conversations of sort of FAQs or expanded FAQs about how to use FAST, but in fact, so you want to use FAST, here's some of the situations in which it's like well implemented, or it really effectively is reflecting your materials you have in hand, or good instances in which it seems to be like either as a linked data or it's not a linked data, but thank you for putting the best of it. That's good. Thank you so much. In which, of course, FAST does have a linked data implementation, which is obviously is very important for us to bring vocabularies together and use in any kind of graph-based metadata production. But the conversation had to do with sort of the positive conversation of, okay, so you already come into the table, you already know that you want to use it. Here's some instances where it would be good to use this particular editor. Here's a good opportunity for you to use it. It doesn't necessarily involve PCC, doesn't necessarily involve like even necessarily agreeing that you have to have a very granular template for a serial, which of course could be quite complicated. But it could be something more simple. And I think about, or in this case, let me then take, or it could be even more complicated. And I say that only because if you remember if anybody saw the bibliographic conceptual modeling interest group week that took place in January, early February this year, there was a conversation about RDA and RDF. And that had to do with really using the links and the entities and really defining those relationships very explicitly in a ways that BibFrame maybe doesn't do so well. And so that's why I think it's instances like this, either in a much simpler way or in a more complex way, where the RDF is exploited very fully in a Sinopia environment. So I'm just wondering if that's the kind of situation, or those are the kinds of situations that we might want to bring up from the LD4 side to figure out best practices to end on a preposition, which is technically bad grammar, but you know what I mean. Thanks. Any thoughts on that? Does that make sense to anybody? I'm getting a nod from Paloma. I just see a nod. So I'm not sure if there's other nodding out there happening silently, which is perfectly fine. My question would be, what might that group look like? And I think hopefully that maybe there would be how LD4 sided should it be? How much representation from PCC should it have, so we can have some kind of communication there? Do we have somebody who works with the PCC group as like a liaison or something, or somebody who's like in charge of getting sort of what they're doing so that we can kind of hear what they're doing? Just curious here about what do you think that group should look like? What should the documentation look like? You know, is it going to be like a step-by-step like procedure thing, or is it kind of like a guidance document of some type? How would you envision this? Trying to get some, I'm just troubleshooting, or you know, throwing out some things to take shots at.
Not so, sorry, I guess since I'm kind of a PCC person on the call, I think kind of related to some of those questions you kind of put out there, Jesse. There were some things that were kind of related that came up in the discussion at the first Sinopia PCC Sinopia Cataloging Affinity Group. Should probably get an acronym. That's hard to say. At any rate, that were along similar lines, and someone pointed out that there's another PCC group for like a working group for metadata application profiles that might be looking at that. But again, it's a PCC group, so that's not necessarily that doesn't like fully overlap with LD4 and Sinopia, but it might be interesting to like, kind of also ask like, what they, or reach out and see like what they're working on or planning to work on along those lines.
That's great. I'm wondering, what you're saying actually made me think this thought. When we start looking, so the years ago when we were looking at things like Ferber, the functional requirements for bibliographic records, and people are trying to figure out how to implement those standards across the board in the various situations in which they were working. And then we see this movement to the LRM, and we see this sort of transition and unification of entity-based descriptions from the IFLA perspective. And it's this global, I'm not gonna say universal because that sounds like more dogmatic, but let's say globalizing perspective of bringing together, international standards, international thinking, representative of different languages and contexts. And then we think about the obviously increasing internationalization of RDA, but that's actually only relevant to RDA then taking a theme of guidance from LRM to figure out how to implement LRM in RDA. So that we then have sort of like, okay, how do we implement these abstractions into sort of functional entity descriptions? Okay, well, then we have, obviously, to go back to the PCC reference here, PCC then takes, and which we're currently working on still, is how do we take then policy statements to guide the standards-based, our local or our discussion, or this group of PCC, how do we apply our standards implementing RDA in our cataloging? So I think what may be then the right or a possible perspective on this would be the same thing. So in this case, the highest level standard is not PCC; it would actually be Sinopia itself. So what does Sinopia do potentially? We talk about its potential as the expansive area, and then from there, one of the possible implementations is PCC, which I'm assuming, because of its work with LC, will also need to be working a lot on BibFrame, not just on RDF generally. So I'm wondering if maybe that just might be one of the sort of like distillations of potential in Sinopia into a more PCC-based and BibFrame-based production. And then another one could come down more on sort of RDA and RDF, and one could be even simpler, just generally looking how to populate like smaller templates that make use of control vocabularies and maybe higher level, preferred titles and just things like this. I mean, there's really all kinds of implementations here. I'm wondering if that's kind of how we should do it instead of looking at it from, because I'm also at a PCC institution, so we do a lot of PCC work, so we're thinking about PCC a bunch. My question is, how do we, thank you, Michelle, for your contributions. She's now gone, but okay, thank you. And so how does that seem like a possible training thing? The question is, how abstract does it get? Or is this also kind of like, so you might want to, so let's say we take the same approach that maybe the FAST committee say wants to work on, so you want to implement FAST, like, so you want to use Sinopia. Like, here's some examples, and we just sort of get some granularity of what some of those examples are. Would that be an example of sort of a good training group thing to start? Or is that still too high level in terms of like promoting it, right? Because you're talking about not just using it, but promoting it in order to expand its use. So you have more eyes coming into it, more people who are running into the situations that we run into. And of course, most cases, we learn a lot from those new contributions or eyes. So how does that sound as a possible running group or working group, maybe? Question is, who's in it? That's one question, but that's a future question. And I'll take any comments on that. Anybody who's, are there people out there right now? I mean, there's lots of names I don't recognize, of course, obviously across the world. And I'm just curious, you know, are people out there like, let's just go back to simple questions in some ways. How familiar are you with Sinopia? Have you logged in? Have you been using it? And I know that we've got some people here who clearly have been using it and done a lot of testing in it. That's obvious. But there's also people who have not. And so I'm just curious, like from maybe a raise of hand, and maybe even a chat comment if you're willing, to talk about like what you think you would like from Sinopia training just to start, or to at least like be more confident to step into it, log in, set up an account, and then start experimenting in the stage, which is it's a low stake server. Doesn't hurt anything. It's totally good. Okay, Jeanette says, and hi Jeanette, how are you doing? Maybe have a larger group in the LD4 with representation from different groups that want to use Sinopia at different levels of granularity and for different formats. This can include but not be limited to the PCC. That is a great suggestion in the sense of, I think it does follow along with what I may have suggested there. That's a good suggestion. Are there people out there who would like to see something like this come about? And those trainings could be simple. We don't need to have anything too complicated, much as to sort of get people started into this. Are there people out there who are listening who would, you know, even by a simple yes, or +1 if you want to take the diploma approach? Oh, yeah, then good. That's great. Okay. Thank you. Okay, this is good. This is great. I'm really appreciative of this. This is the kind of what I wanted to sort of gauge. How are people feeling? What are they kind of needing to do? They need some guidance. They need to know where to go, what it's supposed to look like when they get in. You know, and this is what it takes to give people some sort of granularity of some steps to take up the ladder to, you know, a confident use of Sinopia. Thank you, everybody, with their +1s and yeses. So the question is then, how, this is no rush per se, but I'm curious about how fast do people want to get started in Sinopia? For those who have not ever used it, how are you sort of like chomping at the bit, so to speak, to get into it? Are you waiting for some kind of institutional decision? Are you having bandwidth issues at work, just generally busy, which is of course legit? Just curious, what kind of challenges are people running into right now about maybe where they haven't, why they haven't stepped into it or whatever? And you don't have to be super specific, just, you know, lay out curious. Are there things I just said, or are there other things? Paloma? And you're muted, sorry.
Sorry. It's not answering your question, but it's just to address something that it's on the chat. Arden is putting that he's new to Sinopia. He enjoyed Michelle's workshop. He's very interested in using it. Visual resources and museum, he's not sure of how that fits in the overall workflow. And my thought on that is that like, even if you are not using the same ontologies, there are still certain like system constraints that we have found when we were like building the profiles from the beginning. So I think that it makes sense that even if you're working with different ontologies, you are also part of this group, because you're going to be running into the same challenges that everybody does. And it will be it will be enriching actually to have people that are working with different ontologies and different ways of modeling things. That was just a thought.
Yeah. Any other comments on Paloma's suggestion? Would people appreciate some kind of, it sounds like, I'm just going to repeat sort of, yes, thank you, Arden. And we appreciate that. We're glad we can help. It sounds like what we do need, let's see. Let me just read Jeanette's comment here. Our biggest obstacle is having a way to map metadata created in Sinopia to MARC for use in our ILS as long as we're still using it. We are going to migrate to Folios. So yes, absolutely. There is actually a Sinopia Folio integration group already underway. Technically, it does exist. I'm not sure whether this will eventually change anything. Until that is possible, we can't make a convincing case to work with Sinopia in production. Right. So anything we do in Sinopia will be experimental. Yeah, this is definitely a thing that are, and I think an acknowledgement straight up, which is not a new acknowledgement, just a repetition of acknowledgement that, and I've made this point before in other meetings. I mean, probably Paloma has heard me say this before, and that's just that even MARC, which has been around for basically 50 years, approaching 50 years as a workable, machine-readable data schema, is still actually being innovated on. To some degree, there are some specifics being defined with subfields coming out. There is the addition of ways to handle URIs and real-world objects. There are even fields being defined with specific meanings, both in authority and in bibliographic data. So that stuff is not, so it is not a sort of like, oh, we're just gonna make the fix and like, oh, run the transform and so to speak, we're all done. It's not that simple. It really is. We're in such early stage of a cultural shift to RDF-based and entity-based descriptions that we're sort of, it seems stressful, and it is to some degree in terms of wanting to do our best work. But there's a way in which we're so early that we're in this thing right now. This is where we are. We're in the swim of the waterfall, or whatever you want to call it, whatever rough water metaphor you want to use. We're not in the eddy of the beautiful pond below. We're sort of falling through the water right now, and so just want to have to accept that for what it is, and we can't fight it. Otherwise, we're going to end up like battered against the rocks or whatever. So I just think that I want to acknowledge that straight up, because this is not an easy thing. This is not like just open the door and like say start working. But there's so much functionality now in Sinopia with all of the dev cycles that we've already seen, that it is something that you can right now log into and start producing RDF in. So I don't want to discourage people. I just want to say that this is not easy, and we're definitely in this mix. So we're not going to have a fix with like MARC conversions. We're not going to have a direct and quick integration with like, say, Folio. I don't think that's going to be like a super quick, especially because I think even the RDF data store isn't really even being implemented yet. So there's tons of things that need to go into play there. And so let's see here. If Arden says, some of my issues are related to what Jeanette mentions. I primarily work with small institutions who don't have systems to support sharing and publishing RDF. Exactly right. This is exactly why this centralizing editor has been built. It's not like, I mean, let's just use the OCLC example, for instance. Obviously, big, important institution. A lot of us are using their data somehow. We may not all be connection users. We may not all be like contributing to WorldCat, but we're often using WorldCat data in some way or another, right? Even if it's read-only, it totally, that's another use of OCLC owned data or whatever. So I just say that, we're not running local installations or local, most of us are not running creations, like locally created MARC editors that we just built with our tech team at work to integrate with WorldCat. We're using Connection as a standard building communication tool to edit and manipulate MARC data. So I think that we can see a similar approach where we're going to need to see some centralization here for an RDF-based editor. So in that, we just happen to be in the development of it now, as opposed to the use of a pre-built tool. We work on the time now of after Connection's already been built, we're now in the time in which before Sinopia is being fully used in a production sense. So there's a context to our work in this moment. So I think the training needs to sort of understand that and work in that vein of encouraging people to step out into the Sinopia waters or whatever it is. Just to follow the guidelines that we've already been given. How do we open the door a little bit for new people to walk into Sinopia and feel like, okay, I have this general training here. There's also somebody there who is there to support that training a little bit of Q&A functionality, and it may be personal, but maybe some FAQs that are being produced alongside of it, but hopefully a small team of people who might want to be there to answer questions, either in a sort of more formal consultation way, but sometimes maybe even just one-on-one, having somebody who will answer questions via email, maybe, to where, oh, I'm really running into an issue with whatever, understanding how a property is working in my template or something. So that's the kind of stuff I think we might need some training on generally, assuming that, so you want to use Sinopia, sort of guideline is how we're putting that together. Also, just want to repeat Ryan's comment here, just that I think it's hard for many tech services staff to allot time to create metadata that they cannot use in their existing ecosystems. Yes, very key point. This comes down to percentages of our time, the hours pass, we have materials in hand, and we don't have time to dual entry. In fact, even at LC, in their giant testing for 2 or 3 years now, at least 2 years, I can't remember exactly the timing of their BibFrame editor, they are now in their sort of fuller stage of testing of BibFrame at LC. So that is not something that comes overnight. And they were dual cataloging quite a few things for quite a while before they have been making these next transition stages. Paloma?
Yeah, this is a comment related with what Janet and Tim and Ryan, and other people are making on the chat, which is another, like, a clear need for having profile interoperability, especially when like multiple institutions are going to be creating their own profiles, if they do it, like non-PCC institutions, because I'm thinking that there are some efforts to create these data workflows between BibFrame and Mark, so that that type of exposing the data can happen, but those transformations work with the profile or with the templates that are being built upon. So if we start deviating from whomever scenarios, those whomever like templates or modeling, those transformation tools are being developed, then every institution will have to like reinvent the wheel and create their own transformation tools, as opposed to everybody being able to reuse whatever tools have already been defined. So like that's kind of another reason why we want to stay like, and again, sorry, I'm talking about BibFrame because that's what I'm working with here, and I'm having the same type of issues of like, where if I'm not creating like MARC records and I'm creating BibFrame records, how am I going to like be exposing this data? Like we have not created any new data so far. We are just like experimenting. So yeah, like even if we were not a PCC institution, we want to be able to use those BibFrame to MARC conversion tools. And I think that this, like whatever profiles group, should also be in touch with BibFrame to MARC transformation groups, because that's going to be one of the big dependencies on like modeling decisions. I feel that's been my experience so far.
Yeah, that's a great point. And obviously this is where, because, so let's just say that our cataloging experience has taught us that connection doesn't do everything we want. Hypothetical, right? It doesn't do everything perfectly. It doesn't do everything we want. Let's just say that hypothetically. Yet it's a powerful tool. So we use it for what it does do. And we obviously don't want to break the momentum that we're trying to build up here, but this is a key point that in this midst of trying to figure out what things are going to be, how to get more eyes in the mix by inviting more new people into Sinopia work, contributing, producing templates, and contributing to the discussion, and asking questions to trainers, et cetera, whatever it is this sort of maybe new group becomes, then we have to acknowledge also that at some point there has to be, for development purposes and sort of it's purely pragmatic, to be honest, has to do with sort of targeted or constrained coding by a certain sense. Like, how do we target landscapes for, because of transformations, because of where data is stored, what secure channels it's being exported to some other place. There's all kinds of factors here that do need to be agreed upon, or at least accepted, even if not always agreed upon completely, because we already don't agree on some of the current tools we use at scale. So in terms of just like what things do perfectly or don't do perfectly. So let me ask this about we have 5 minutes, and I know that time is super close, and I'm going to seriously take that as a guide point. What if I wrote up some kind of pseudo mission statement like thing, or pseudo charge like thing, and started circulating it through some LD4 channels, maybe some Sinopia channels, a couple points, to see if we can't sort of figure out how to get this thing started, who might want to join this training group, how we can write some. I'm gonna say they are encouraging training documents to encourage people to get into Sinopia and take the next steps. Does that sound like a +1 worthy idea, or is that like a thumbs down idea? I'm getting 1 thumbs up. That's good. Just to start the ball rolling. I don't want to drop this thing here if it's something that we can at least take the next step on. I tell you what, unless I get a nay, which obviously this is not the official voting body per se, but unless I get a nay, I think I might want to take that step as my next thing. Sort of put up some kind of mission statement, sort of yeah. Well, thanks, Frank. That's a good idea. So you're suggesting that in one of our guideline sentences, so you want to use Sinopia, you would see something like what some of the work looks like. Okay, that's very good. So real life examples, something that has been produced so that you can see what to expect. Okay, thank you so much. That is very helpful. All right, 3 minutes to go. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm happy to use that as my guidance. I'm not sure who to send this to exactly, but let's see. Let me ask one more question here by Ryan, and then we do need to go to the next thing, which is, I wonder if a hurdle for profile interpretability for new Sinopia users is the coexistence of the nested templates, e.g. title data with the broader templates for work instance, item admin metadata in the template list search. So this is actually an important question about how things are nested or not nested, and the sort of workflow elements that are there. There are some workflow functionality that we need to be considering there in terms of what things people want to be producing, whether or not they're going to search for a specific. Say if you want to add admin metadata, do you want to produce it in that specific template, or do you want to search for it as one you've already produced? Good question. There's a workflow element there. So let me think about that. I'm not sure that I can answer that in this first thing, but I think that's something that we will definitely want to process through. So I'll take a first stab at that, and I don't know how this communication is going to go exactly, but I am going to start drafting something and send it out to a few people to figure out where we can go. So thank you, everybody, for your time, and this has been encouraging, and it does give us a sense of kind of where we are and what we kind of want, together as we're working on these projects. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a good rest of your conference and enjoy the rest of your Thursday, if in fact it is Thursday. So thank you, everybody. Cheers.